So thank you all so much for inviting us in, and particularly thank you to Julie for this tremendous program. It's amazing to see so many people in the room interested in this topic, and I think that the number of people in the room is testament to both the enormity of the problem and also to the growing interest in this issue. When the two of us got started on this issue, because we've been literally consumed with plastic trash, no pun intended, for some time, and it's spanned both personal and professional for us. Many of you probably know this, but we got engaged in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and we've spent the last 2.5 years tracking plastic garbage across 30,000 miles of ocean. So Marcus really knows how to show a girl a good time. But in the last few months, the two of us met an individual that has changed the scope of our work and really truly inspired us with a new sense of urgency for this issue. An amazing person. Next slide, please. And I think you can see why, for those of you who are parents or uncles or aunts, we know in our lifetimes we've seen this issue of plastic pollution magnify 100-fold in some areas of the ocean. So I think now about what our little almost 3-month-old will encounter in the future. Will there be clean beaches and oceans for her to swim in someday? So this really inspires us with a new sense of urgency for our work. I'm going to dive right into some of our work on the gyres. Our interest in spanning our work to the 5 oceanic gyres started in 2008. Next slide, please. In the North Pacific Gyre, with Marcus, Captain Charles Moore, and 3 other sailors. We sailed 4,000 miles from Hilo, Hawaii back to Los Angeles. And I want to show you a quick current modeling study of how the gyres work. Many of you know already, a gyre is an oceanic current system that creates a massive vortex in the ocean where floating plastics are slowly accumulating. Next slide, please. So this is a modeling study that shows how the North Pacific Gyre, which is the most well-known of the 5, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, moves over a 20-year period. So next slide, please. You can see these drifters heading from the United States towards Japan, and from Japan back to the West Coast in half a year. Next slide, please. 1 year. Next slide. 3 years. You can also see how quickly those drifters from Japan are making their way towards the United States, which brings to mind the debris from the tsunami debris field. Next slide, please. And here we have over 10 years. Next slide. And 20 years. So over those 20 years, you can see 2 patterns starting to emerge. A, you see how quickly that debris moves from California to Japan and back. A single piece of floating debris can make that full rotation in anywhere from 6 to 10 years. But over a period of 20 years, you can see it pooling in these 2 areas that we call the eastern and the western garbage patch. The eastern is the most well-known between California and Hawaii, but the western garbage patch has really just been discovered in the last 3 months, and Marcus will talk more about that. Next slide. So here are the 5 subtropical gyres. When we began this work, there was a little bit known about the North Atlantic, a fair amount known about the North Pacific, but virtually nothing known about the 3 Southern Hemisphere gyres. So that's the new information we can share with you. Next slide. So a lot is already known about the marine animal impacts. We've talked about this extensively. This is a study going back to 1997. So if you look at these numbers, these are very conservative estimates. For example, we know that the number of sea turtle species today impacted by plastic marine pollution is 100%, no longer 86%. Roughly half of all marine mammal species and seabirds are impacted by our plastic debris. Next slide, please. But what's relatively new information is how this may affect human health. From that 2008 voyage, we collected 671 of these fish called lanternfish, also called myctophids. Very important species in the open ocean. They make up about 60% of the ocean's fish biomass. So even though we don't eat these fish directly, we eat the larger species, the tuna, the myctophids, the tuna, the mahi-mahi, the squid, that are feeding on these fish. And this is what we found in their stomachs in the laboratory. These are surface feeders, so they come up to the surface at night to feed, and you can see the level of plastic in their stomachs along with zooplankton. Next slide, please. Here's another stomach sample. Next slide. And this will show you how easy it is for this mistake to be made. So here is a slide of a drop of our gyre samples under a microscope. And take a good look at this sample, because there are 2 pieces of plastic film. So take a good look, see if you can identify plastic versus zooplankton. Next slide, please. And there you see the 2 pieces of plastic. So a very easy mistake to make. Next slide. And here are the results from that 2008 study. Out of 671 of these fish, roughly 35% had plastics in their stomachs. That study has since been repeated by Scripps, who found roughly 9%. So what we know is that a large sector of small keystone species are ingesting plastic. And the huge unknown is what impact might this have on us. So this was also the voyage where we got engaged, and Marcus announced that before the wedding, we had another project to do.
Next slide. Next. Okay, so our idea was to do something to bring attention to the fact that the plastics in the North Pacific Gyre, the amount was increasing very quickly. Also, we're for the first time finding plastics ingested by fish. There's a new phenomenon. To see them across this entire family, the Myctophidae, we're ingesting all these microplastic particles, and they make up the majority biomass of the world's oceans. It's just like, holy cow, we're now feeding our trash to fish that feed the fish that we harvest to feed the world. So that message we thought needed to get out there very quickly. Now I've experienced, prior to this issue, building plastic bottle boats. I rafted the Mississippi River on one back in 2003, and I thought, okay, I'll take that confidence in boat building, and let's cross the Gyre. So the idea was to take 15,000 plastic bottles, build a boat, launch from here, Los Angeles, and see how long it takes to get to Hawaii. Next slide. So we took about 20 or so broken sailboat masts, went to all these junkyards and just got the aluminum tube and put the bottles in these giant pontoons made from netting under the masts. Next slide. And for a cabin, we chose a Cessna 310 aircraft fuselage. It's the first Cessna to cross the ocean. Proud to say that. Next slide. Put it all together and called it junk. And that began what we thought might be like a 6-week odyssey to get from here, riding those gyre currents to get to Hawaii. Next slide. It took us a whopping three months, about 13 weeks. Ran out of food, ended up eating lots of peanut butter and mahi-mahi until we met Roz Savage. You all know who Roz Savage is? Yeah. So she's the first woman to row a boat solo, row this canoe around the world. And on her leg from California to Hawaii, right before she left, I was like, good luck, Roz, and I'll see you in Hawaii. We left a week apart. And like 2 months later, I'm calling Ann almost every day on the satellite phone saying, I miss you so much, baby. And she says, hey, Roz is like 200 miles from you. This is like 2 months later. We're out of food, peanut butter and mahi-mahi. And I'm like, does she have any food? And they're like, well, yeah. And actually, she needs water. So I got water. So it took us 6 days to find each other. I mean, every day calling Roz on her satellite phone saying, where are you now? I'm over here, you're over there, let's meet. It took us 6 days, we met, and Joel and I were the two navigators on this junk raft. And then we met Roz, we spent 2 hours together. Joel jumped in, speared a mahi-mahi, we cooked fresh fish for her. She gave us 3 bags of food, turkey jerky, Lara bars, and expedition meals. We had made 10 gallons of water. It was like exchanging these gifts of life in the middle of nowhere. Just a phenomenal moment in my life. Then we met again 3 weeks later in Waikiki. This is a video. We can play this real quick, if you don't mind.
All the labels off our cans, we got rusted, now we gotta eat them. Corn. Come on, corn! Give me corn, give me corn, give me corn, give me corn, corn. Beans! Oh, do this! No wind. We're completely becalmed today. No wind whatsoever. We're just gonna fish and eat. Fishy, 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 fishy. Oh, here he is. Ready? North Pacific Gyre, roughly 1,000 miles east of Hawaii. We're finding lots of plastic on the surface of the ocean. It's mostly small fragments, blue, green, white, and black, among many different kinds of zooplankton. Everywhere you go in the North Pacific Ocean, we find plastic. So I filleted this fish, thinking we're going to eat it. Here's what I found. It's full of plastic. This is the whole reason that we're out here, to bring this to your attention. The plastic isn't benign. The fish won't pass it. The plastic is full of persistent organic pollutants, things like PCBs, DDT, PAHs, things that are known human carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, things you don't want in your body, but they're in the fish that we eat. I don't want plastic in my sushi.
So the reason, almost 4 years later, I still use this story is to tell a story, to tell a very personal experience of why I found this issue so important that I would risk my life to go across the ocean on a raft of trash. And I would suggest find your own story, find your own experience of how this impacts you, impacts your youth, impacts how you feel about the future and the present. Just bring your story into it, and it makes your presentation much more powerful.
Just don't leave your fiancé back on land. Next slide. So this was really the main reason for this voyage. This was a pretty shocking photo, but really underscores why we think this issue needs to get out to the public. Now, this is not to say that we have any idea how large a scope this is, how many fish are ingesting plastic, but this is a fish, unlike the myctophids, the lanternfish, that people eat directly. And as hungry as they were, this fish went overboard. Once it made it to the fillet pan, and they found 17 pieces of plastic in its stomach. Next slide, please. And the reason for that is what we know about the way plastics behave in the ocean environment and even on land. That plastics are like a sponge for persistent organic pollutants, POPs, things like PCBs, pesticides, oil drops from your car, things that will wash into the ocean environment, but that are hydrophobic, won't mix with water. They're lipophilic or oleophilic and will stick to oily substances, fatty substances. Plastic is petroleum-based. So there's this synergy between plastics and these POPs to the degree that one single particle of plastic can have up to 1 million times higher concentration of these POPs. And this is from the work of Dr. Takata in Japan, a scientist who's been looking at nurdles around the world and looking at their concentration of POPs. In fact, anyone in this room, you might know about Pellet Watch. You can collect 100 to 200 nurdles on your local beach, send them to Dr. Takata, and he'll analyze the POPs sticking to the surface. And it's not just pollutants in plastic, in the ocean, that stick to plastic. It's also all the synthetic chemicals that go into making plastic, the plasticizers, the things that make plastic pliable or durable. Next slide, please. Now, one of the reasons we were thinking about this on a personal level is the second slide you saw, our little girl, now almost 3 months old. When Marcus and I began this work, we were thinking about a future family. So I was curious about what was in my body, what we call the body burden, which is the sum total of chemicals that we all have in our body, from the products we put in our hair and on our face, to the water we drink, to the food we eat, to all the chemicals we're in contact with on a daily basis. We all carry this body burden within us, in our blood serum, in our fat tissues. And I'm going to show you what we found in my body. And so this is a video. Oops, go back. And this should be a video.
So we just took about 60 cc's of my blood. We're now going to have it centrifuged to be sampled for PCBs, DDTs, and other chemicals. So we probably should, if you can stand here, do one more round. So very much of your blood.
That's my sister.
One more round of my blood. Apparently they need a lot.
and that's my little sister. So when I got the results of these studies back, they color-coded them according to where I fit on the national average. Green was for good, orange was for so-so, and red was for bad. So when I first looked at these results and saw that I was green for 3 out of 4 and orange for only 1, which was flame retardants, I thought, awesome, I'm doing pretty good. But then I stopped and thought, well, it's kind of outrageous that this is now the new baseline. The fact that we have any of these chemicals in our body is now considered normal. And the fact that my levels for flame retardants, which I imagine anyone in this room would have the same results, we live in California, we use a lot of flame retardants. The fact that this is now the new baseline struck me as really wrong. The levels of chemicals in my body, as with anyone again in this room, are parts per million. So they're tiny, tiny amounts. But the new understanding of a lot of these chemicals, we used to believe that the dose makes the poison. And that can even relate to water. Enough water can be poisonous. But now what we understand about a lot of these chemicals that can act as endocrine disruptors, hormone mimics, is that it's not the dose that makes the poison, it's also the timing of the exposure. Next slide, please. For example, when a woman is pregnant. This is my little girl when she was 4 months in utero. And it's at times when a woman is going, when a child is going through critical stages of development, say brain development or gender differentiation, that tiny, tiny amounts of those chemicals can have devastating effects. But again, we're at the very beginning of our understanding of how these chemicals affect us. It's really difficult to do these studies on humans. But what we do know is that we have enough information to warrant concern, to demand that the companies that make these chemicals prove to us that they're safe, instead of the other way around. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to get into our work on the 5 oceanic gyres. Because when we began this, we noticed that no one was going to the South Pacific, the South Atlantic, or the Indian Ocean. So we cobbled together our wedding money and decided, instead of a honeymoon, next slide please, next slide, to cross the North Atlantic from St. Thomas to Bermuda to the Azores. The eastern edge of this North Pacific gyre, also the North Atlantic, the Sargasso Sea, was relatively unexplored. So I'm going to show you a short video of what that research looks like at sea, including one of the more surprising things we found. And I do want to say that one of the models of what we do with 5 gyres is we launch these expeditions to unknown areas, but then we invite people to join us. We've had a number of Surfrider folks join us on board. We've had artists, we've had musicians, filmmakers, journalists, even a bagpipe player from Scotland. We had the founder of Chico Bag, Andy Keller, who brought his bag monster outfit on board. And Sarah Bayless sailed with us across one of the oceans. I know that you had her in your class recently. And what we want is for people to get engaged, inspired, do the research with us, and then go back to their communities to be agents of change. So we will have more expeditions, and we're always looking for interesting people to join us. Next slide. Go back one. Well, you know what? Maybe I did cut the video for this one. Anyway, well, we can show it at the end. Next slide. So you'll see here the samples that we collected crossing the North Atlantic. You'll notice a pretty conspicuous gap there. The seas are not always favorable to our research, and this we called the hurricane gap. So this is an area we do need to return to, but we got some really good data points on this expedition, and we found that, yes, plastic is an issue in the North Atlantic as it is in the North Pacific. Yeah, possibly in 2014. Next slide, please. Oh, here's the video. So we're going to show a video now.
Let's bring it in.
Lots of larval fish, sargassum, and plastic particles. Look at that. We're in the middle of the North Atlantic Gyre, also called the Sargasso Sea. It's called the Sargasso Sea because of sargassum. It's a kind of seaweed that filled our nets. But it's also full of small particles of plastic. What you got, Anna?
I see one. It's a mouthpiece, I think, for a boxer. It's got some barnacles, some sargassum. This is 45 minutes of scooping through another windrow in the middle of the Sargasso Sea.
Yeah. Cool.
So we just pulled out this plastic bucket, and we found a triggerfish inside that's so big that it looks like it can't get out.
I think his entire life is in this jar. Here's a triggerfish. Look at these teeth. Look at this plastic bottle. And we find these all around the North Atlantic Gyre. Bits of plastics chewed on by marine life. And no,
it was very clean, maybe several decades of circulations. So next up was the Indian Ocean. This was one we got to do on a very unusual research vessel. Next slide, please. We were invited by some people from Amsterdam to cross the Indian Ocean on this boat. Not the ideal research boat, but a pretty fun one nonetheless. Next slide. You could go all the way out to the bowsprit and look for debris floating by. And sure enough, we found it there. Next slide. As we skirted closer and closer to the center of this gyre in the Indian Ocean, and this is one we need to return to, our samples started to look like this, the familiar collection of large pieces, but mostly these broken down microplastics mixed in with marine life. Next slide. Next up was the South Atlantic Gyre. We did 3 passes through this gyre, so we got some really good data from this part of the world. Some really harrowing journeys, but next slide, please. Sample after sample after sample looked like this. In total, over the last 2.5 years, we've collected over 400 samples, and only 2 have come up clean. Next slide, please. And those 2 were in this gyre, in the South Pacific, off the coast of Chile. You'll recognize up there the bag monster. That's Andy Keller, the founder of Chico Bag. Professor from Santa Monica College, Garen Bagdasarian, who teaches marine biology, and another cast of characters, some filmmakers, scientists, journalists, from Tree Hugger. Next slide, please. And normally what we find are these microplastics, broken down fragments, but we do find the occasional large piece, buoys and crates and fishing related gear, and plastic film you'll see up there in the left-hand corner. Next slide, please. And this is actually our first publication coming out. It just got accepted. Marcus wrote a paper on the South Pacific Gyre findings that is just coming out in Marine Pollution Bulletin. So this is really exciting for us to finally have published data showing that we do indeed have a garbage patch in this part of the world. You can see the blue dots are lower concentration, the red is higher concentration. So it was a perfect arc, almost like a perfect bell curve in this part of the world. Entering the gyre, very little plastic. Once we got in the gyre, spikes in plastic, and then leaving the gyre, it dipped back down. Next slide, please. We landed on this gyre. You'll probably recognize that on Easter Island, which was an interesting place in terms of the metaphor of collapse. Next slide, please. And ringing the entire island was this plastic. You can see on the left, that's what the beaches look like normally. And when you scraped away the top level of either sand or rock, this is what it looked like underneath. This broken down particulate of plastic trash that's not coming from the islanders, but that's washing up from Pacific Rim countries, washing up from South America and all over. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcus to talk about tsunami debris and other expeditions.
So real quick, our most recent expeditions this year was the tsunami debris field and the Great Lakes. So the tsunami debris field, we sailed from Marshall Islands to Tokyo and wait for 2 weeks, a couple typhoons pass, and then Tokyo 4 weeks, grueling weeks back to Hawaii. Right through the subsurface debris field. So that gyre sample that passed around, that was found roughly halfway between the 2 points, Tokyo and Hawaii, as well as this boat. So we're finding lots of macro debris from the tsunami itself, like this boat. Next slide. Here's our route. You can see about 4,000 miles. Next slide. We found, you can see a truck tire. The subsurface debris field is a debris field where there is no windage of collecting the debris. So that previous slide, go back one for a second. That purple mass, that's just below the waves. At this point, there was already stuff washing ashore here. And you heard of the Harley-Davidson, you heard of maybe all the fishing buoys washing ashore, as well as a big dock in Oregon. And there was a big ship that was scuttled off the coast of British Columbia. Lots of big stuff. I was catching wind. riding those currents. That's subsurface, what's just below the waves. So in reality, the debris field is the entire North Pacific. I mean, as stuff was hitting the shore, we found this boat really close on the Tokyo side of the North Pacific Gyre. So the point is that it's really wide. The Pacific Ocean distributes debris very quickly, very wide, and then it enters the gyre currents, where we find it spins and gets stuck in the east or western side. They also found a western garbage patch here as well, a little accumulation zone right over here that was holding some of that tsunami debris. Next slide, and the next one, jump to. And some older debris. This, I'm sure, was in the ocean long before the tsunami happened. There's lots of background plastic already there. That gyre sample you saw in that jar, if you had gone there before the tsunami, I bet it would look the same. There's so much trash already there. The tsunami was a small bump in debris, mostly plastic in the ocean. Next slide. So what is that material? When we use that word debris, and I urge you to get off if you're not using it now, just don't use that word debris describing this issue. It is plastic that's out there. The tsunami showed us that not just how the currents move, but over time, what's left? Natural disasters today, they leave their mark behind in plastic. So we found 820 bits and pieces of material. So we had our crew sit on both sides of the boat for 1 hour at a time with a clipboard and a stopwatch. Did this 41 times, 41 non-consecutive hours of observation. 820 pieces, one piece every 3.6 minutes floated by. And by visual observation, 98% was plastic. So the tsunami showed us that in time, the metals go away. That metal piece is that rim on the tire. The few bits of glass, a few light bulbs, one fluorescent tube. We saw a couple pieces of wood go by, one piece of tatami mat from Japanese flooring. The majority was all just plastic trash. Next slide. So you can see here these red blobs. These are where we have been already with 5 gyres. The yellow is where we need to go. We made it through the eastern Sargasso Sea in 2014. You're invited there. There are maybe 14 seats available. We want to hit the Indian Ocean, the western side again. But this background picture you see, if you need a model to show people what plastic in the ocean looks like, this is a good one. It came out last year. Labreton and Barrero wrote this paper, and they created this model based on not just ocean currents, but population density and where rivers are outfalling into the ocean. So based on that data, and assuming there's uniform consumption and loss of plastics around the world, which I think is fairly accurate. You have people all around the world using plastic bags and straws and all the other kind of single-use stuff that we see. So based on that, you've got the gyres identified, but also there are other hotspots. In the closed bays, gulfs, and seas, we find plastic accumulating. So the Mediterranean Sea has major hotspots. But we think the most polluted of all is the Bengal Sea, way over there. And we're planning on this May, our daughter's first trip at sea is going to be sailing from, if all goes well, Sri Lanka to Singapore through what might be the most plastic impacted water body on the planet. Next slide. Next slide. Trying to solve this issue by going out in the gyres and picking out plastics, trying to say what this is, where it came from, it's almost impossible. It's a major uphill battle. But it is really it's more of an upstream battle. If we go from the gyres, knowing what's out there, then go upstream, find out where the source is, that's where solutions lie. And we did that this summer with the Great Lakes Expedition. It's our first time going out of the ocean into a closed water body, chasing upstream. Here's what we found. Next slide. So our typical equipment, the same stuff, a manta trawl, the same trawl we used in the North Atlantic a couple years earlier. Next slide. And a typical sample. Now this is different biologicals, more grasses, some zooplankton there. Next slide. And we found some typical things, broken small fragments. These were broken perhaps by road abrasion, we think. Bits of bottle caps and forks and knives and things. Next slide. But in that sample, looking really closely, in fact, I purchased a little digital microscope to get a good view of these small particles. We found these little microplastic beads. Now, I have not seen this in the North Atlantic samples that Ann and I collected a couple years prior. But these Great Lakes feed the North Atlantic gyre. So what are these things, and why aren't they in the North Atlantic? It's one big question that comes from this research. So these microbeads, how micro are they? Next slide. Next slide. Lincoln's afro. They're tiny, tiny. In one sample, roughly 1,600 microplastic microbeads in one surface trawl. That's twice the number of particles than any other trawl we've done around the world. So there's this plastic dust in America's waters. Now see, this is where we can do something, because the plastic is not degraded to the point of not being able to recognize it. We can identify this. These microbeads are the same size and shape, next slide, as the microbeads you find in these facial scrubbers. So I went to Walgreens and I got these 4 products, and these 2 over here, and this is something you can do, and it's an amazing presentation or a demonstration you can do. Take a black t-shirt, take a little mason jar, squirt some of that stuff in the mason jar, shake it up, put the t-shirt over, take the lid off, t-shirt over it, pour it through, squeeze out the bubbles. When you open your hand with a t-shirt, black t-shirt, it's a sea of white dust. And that's the facial scrubbers, those microbeads. Imagine the insanity of taking plastic, rub on your face, then intentionally it's designed to go down the drain into our water bodies, out into the ocean. I mean, this, you can point to a company, you can point to a country, they're America's waters. So the solution we have is, first of all, we have good data. You start with that. Then you go to the companies and provide an alternative. These 2 products, apricot shells and cocoa beans. So I think we have a potential victory on our hands with this microbead campaign we're going to launch next year. Next slide. Yeah, once again, it's obvious. It's just blatant to use plastic in this way. I mean, they often blame the consumer that if you're not making the right choice, you're putting that trash on the ground. Blame the consumer. This is the producer doing it directly. They're putting their product, designing it to be thrown into America's waters, or the world's waters. Next slide.
So having seen what we've seen across 5 oceans, some 30,000 miles of ocean, we're pretty firmly convinced that cleanup at sea can't happen. I'm not going to say it's completely impossible, but impractical, economically, and not really feasible. And you've seen that sample full of marine life. And to filter or sieve the top layer of ocean without removing tons of biomass would be extremely difficult. And that's just scratching the surface, because an area of research that still needs to be filled is what's below the ocean surface and what's on the ocean floor. Because roughly 50% of plastics, you've probably covered this, will sink. So that's a huge unknown. So solutions are not to go out to the gyres and clean up plastic. If anything, cleanup begins on the islands within the gyres and on our local shorelines to prevent that stuff from going back out to the gyre. But better solutions go further upstream. Next slide, please. Starting with every one of us. The choices we make every day, leading by example, avoiding disposables. But that alone is not going to solve the problem, because we are in the choir and there's 7 billion and climbing of us on the face of the planet, and there's no way we're going to educate everyone to do the right thing. And in some places, they don't have options to do the right thing. Next slide, please. So we really think that going further up the chain, the solutions begin with innovation with companies that make these products and with legislation. So we've seen some examples of innovation, bioplastics. There's a lot of work to be done here, but there needs to be some sort of truly biodegradable, marine degradable option, or truly recyclable, because we don't really recycle our plastics. We downcycle them, we export them abroad, and it's a design flaw. So if we can really design for recycling, this is a much better approach, cradle to cradle. Next slide, please. Legislation. So we've seen a lot of wins, a lot with the help of Surfrider Foundation, bag bans, fees placed on plastic bags. Hopefully we'll move on to other disposables soon, and this is taking storm across the entire world, from Bhutan to Bangladesh to China. There's legislation worldwide. This is a problem not just in this country, but literally every continent in the world is draining plastics into our oceans. You heard a little bit about extended producer responsibility, and we think that this is extremely promising, has taken off more in Europe, but the companies that make these products should have a plan for the end of their life cycle. Next slide. Education, of course, that goes without saying. We need the next generation, including little 3-month-olds, to be engaged and to be able to be agents of change. Next slide, please. Social media campaigns. So every single one of us in this room with a laptop or with a smartphone can become instigators of viral campaigns. This is a good example that was launched by our communications director, Steve Wilson, who's also an active member of Surfrider Foundation, to get national parks to reverse a decision to make a ban on plastic bottles illegal in the parks. There was an attempt to ban plastic bottles in parks. Coca-Cola got involved, put some pressure on, so the decision was being swayed. And then through change.org, through massive social media campaign and 100,000 signatures, Steve was able to get people, with the help of many others, to reverse this decision. And now national parks are adopting bans on plastic bottles. So this to me was really inspiring. I sometimes lose faith in the daily deluge of online petitions that we all get. But this to me was a reminder that social media campaigns can really work, and that if we get enough critical mass, we can really put pressure on the companies that are some of the biggest polluters. Next slide, please. Global monitoring. This is something that we're trying to encourage other sailors, other citizen scientists to help us with. We're one small organization with access to boats through our partnerships, but there are people all over the world that have boats or a desire to hop on a boat with a research trawl and gather some citizen science. So anyone who's happening to sail across the world, talk to Marcus, because there's very valuable data that you can gather. Next slide. And finally, for the more adventurous of you, and I'm sure there are some of you in this room, you can always come on board with us, join us on one of these expeditions. It's a way to help us with some of the fundraising, but more importantly, it's a way to get more people to actually have firsthand reports of this issue and go back to their communities, inland communities, coastal communities, and share this, whether it's through film, through art, through public presentations, through any number of ways to engage your local communities. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for questions. Next slide, if you want to keep in, oh, sorry, this is the next expedition happening, is the Bay of Bengal in the spring of 2013. But then the following year, we'll be returning to the North Atlantic Gyre, and we'll have many spots available on those expeditions, and we would love for some of you to get involved. Next slide. And here's how you can keep in touch with us. We'd love to talk to any of you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.